Okay, so welcome to the Centre for Arts and Learning online. I'm Miranda Matthews, Head of Centre for Arts and Learning. We're delighted to have with us today Professor John Baldacchino, and this is the first event in our CAL All for the Arts series. In 2022-2023, the Centre for Arts and Learning is focusing on ways of approaching being all for the arts. So this event with renowned artist educator Professor John Baldacchino is the first in this series. And inclusivity in the arts is a continuing issue for education in Britain. We will be exploring all the positive indications that the arts are beneficial for all in what Meskimmon calls a transversal politics for equality and participation. CAL research events will also address the factors that impact social value for experiences in the arts and learning. At CAL, we are arguing that unequal access and opportunities in the arts are detrimental to everyone, and that some embedded structures, processes, policies, and pedagogies need to change to alter patterns of othering. What John Baldacchino sees as willed strangers in the search for inclusion could contend with this idea of othering. We know from our recent research and from reports gathered by organisations such as the Runnymede Trust and Sutton Trust that complexities such as those of race, gender, class, sexuality, age and disability are for reflection and review in all our work towards a greater sense of belonging in assembled understandings of cultural differences. So taking up a view of arts practice as being the daily extraordinary, the incredible in the everyday, with an artivist stance, or as Patricia Hill Collins terms creative social action, CAL will explore how learning in the arts can increase the expressive empowerment and diversity of socially present voices. So to introduce Professor John Baldacchino, so we're really pleased to welcome John Baldacchino. John is an internationally known arts educator, researcher, artist, and prolific writer. John is Professor of Art Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison School of Education, where he specializes in art, philosophy, and education. So before John joined that faculty, he was faculty at Columbia University in New York and at Warwick, Dundee, Falmouth, and RGU in Britain. John's many books that link to this talk today include Education Beyond Education, Art's Way Out, and Artisan Learning. He is currently completing Lessons of Belonging and co-editing with Herna Severat the Bloomsbury Handbook of Continental Philosophy of Education. So I'll hand over to you now, John, for you to share your slides and begin your presentation.
Thank you. Let's see how this works. So... Yeah, is that working?
Yeah,
okay.
That's working.
And you hear me, yeah? So, yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. I remember a long time ago, I came to Goldsmiths when I was still, I think, a doctoral student at Warwick University. I remember I gave a lecture on Caravagism and modernity. It was pretty interesting. I can't remember when it was, but it was really... so I mean, this takes me back. Also, I worked a lot with Dennis Atkinson, so I'm really pleased to be here. It's a bit like being home in a way. And I hope this lecture won't be too long. But what I'm trying to do is, because the subject is I've been doing a lot of work on this for a long time. I mean, the book on this subject, which came out 10 years ago now, I realize it's called Art's Way Out. And it also builds on various other things which I've done before. And in the meantime, then I published other books, as you mentioned, Artisan Learning, which came out in 2019, but also recently, 2020, I published the book on Ivan Illich. And I'm mentioning these things not to give you a list of my publications, but more or less to give you kind of where I'm coming from. The other thing which I've been thinking about, especially when I was asked to do this lecture, is why do I engage in this, and where possible other things which influence me. And the other thing which influences me, and I think you need to bear this in mind, probably as you could gather from my accent, although you know I've worked in Britain most of my academic life, and also here in New York, is that I come originally from a former British colony, which is Malta. And that has a very important effect particularly, I mean, recently I've been looking at issues of colonization and, the whole idea of decolonizing the curriculum. And recently I published a chapter actually in a book which came out in one of the series curated by the School of Education in Cambridge, or rather the Faculty of Education, but actually it's the primary school of education that they have there. And it came out as a discussion between myself and a colleague of mine who happens to be British, but also of Caribbean descent, who also works here in Wisconsin. He's an artist called Faisal Abdullah. He was very active in London still. And we discussed actually our experience of education, of art education as well, in a colonial context. I, coming from, grew up in Malta just after, I grew, just after independence and going to school there. And he, as a Caribbean British person, but also his parents were Caribbean, came here, and how those kind of experiences. And the whole idea of engaging with that also reinforced my notion of the stranger and how the stranger comes into all this stuff. So, I mean, those kind of things need to be kept in mind, because this is not just a philosophical exercise or some kind of theoretical kind of abstraction that I'm talking about, but very much something which has to do with lived experience. So, I mean, the issue so what is the question here? The question here has to do with the whole idea of inclusion, but it also has to do with the idea of how inclusion in and of itself presents us, as we know and as we have experienced a lot, especially in recent times with the emergence of anti-politics, particularly with movements like Trump's, Bolsonaro, but also what's happening in Italy at the moment, for example, with Meloni and the others, is how there is an issue which has to do with inclusion, which has been questioned a lot by the extreme right, but also where I think we have failed to reply to that in terms of how we see inclusion within a context that is not just limited to the city. And by this, I mean the whole idea of citizenship, the whole idea of borders, the whole idea of identity, but also the question of the history, which I mentioned with colonialism and others, which is actually, weighing on us, especially the concept of liberty. And the whole idea of the liberties of inclusion, the word liberty here also has a kind of ironic notion in it, in terms of what do we mean by freedom, but also in terms of how kind of, you could argue, taking liberties with inclusion has also put us in a very, very precarious situation in terms, especially when we're talking about schooling, when we're talking about education, and more specifically in this context of how the arts, rather than just art, plays a role in this. So here I'm bringing in the, Gillian Rose. I don't know whether you know her work. Gillian Rose was a professor of philosophy and sociology, and actually I remember her when I was at Warwick, and I'm very fond of her work, partly because although some people would say her work is impenetrable, she had a lot to offer by way of not only her philosophical approach, but also in terms of other things. Like in this particular book, which was published actually after her untimely death, Mourning Becomes the Law, she talks a lot about the whole idea of the representation of fascism with capital F and fascism of representation. And it comes from that, film, or actually more the novel of The Remains of the Day. She starts from there, where you have the kind of dilemma of the butler who was looking at, who is witnessing his lord, his boss, who, this is just when fascism was growing in Germany, but this is back in Britain, where actually there is this issue of his dilemma of when he's seeing his employer, who is a fascist, and he wants to appease Hitler, meeting all these people. But on the other hand, he himself, he didn't know what to do, whether he wants to serve these people, who wants to kind of, engage with these people, because on the other hand, he also has this dilemma. And this is a dilemma which actually we have as well. And Gillian Rose draws on that in terms of this kind of play between the fascism, the representation of fascism with an F, historically speaking, but then the after the war, and now the whole idea of how representation in itself becomes a form of authoritarianism. And I'm quoting this because I think this is one of the questions. It is possible, she says, to anticipate that that states which combine social libertarianism with political authoritarianism, whether they have traditional class parties or not, they could become susceptible to fascist movements. And I know fascism is a very strong word, but actually we think about it in terms of forms of authoritarianism, forms of anti-politics that we're seeing today, the forms of how actually notions like inclusion and identity are being dismissed also in schools. I mean, I'm working and living in America, so I mean, you know, there are examples here where even books are banned. And that thing is interesting because it poses questions on how, even though after so many years of working towards inclusion, why on earth is this still an issue? And why on earth are we still kind of, you know, dealing with those kind of questions? And that becomes quite intriguing because, you know, I see this more from perspective that comes from the arts. So again, to set the frame for this, the framework for this lecture is this, and this kind of comes from some of my thoughts, which I've kind of developed over the years, but also this goes back to my book, Art's Way Out. And I went back to think, okay, what was the question here? Because I mean, I keep thinking of talking about exiting, but what do I mean by this? Why am I talking about this? Because sometimes even myself, I kind of think about, particularly because the word exit is also very loaded, you know. In the British context, exit also has to do with Brexit. So, I mean, what are we talking about here? Because Brexit is not exactly an inclusive form of thinking. What are we exiting? So the whole idea is to do with where we are placed and where we place ourselves. So if you think about, I am exiting a union, to take the analogy of the EU, I'm exiting a union which is very much inclusive, or at least that's the argument, then that's leaving me out in a context which is very different from what I'm talking about here in terms of exiting as exiting into a wider world. So the situation, at least the way I see it, is that we have a civil society which is based on very much on individual interests. And it does presume the conflict of such interests. So, I mean, when we think about freedom, it also tied to this whole idea of this conflict of interests. It's interesting to think about, especially in the wake of the recent issues which have to do with the revocation of Wade versus Rose, basically has to do with fertility rights in the United States, is what freedom is all about. And a lot of people have been talking also about private liberties and common liberties, or socially exchanged liberties. So there's an interesting thing there. So keep that in mind. And this whole idea of a society based on individual interests emerges from, or brings out, a transgression, if you like, under the pretext of social order, which sometimes it assumes that it's including and emancipating everyone under the banner of social equity, liberty, and meritocracy. But actually, we know that that also works against itself, so to speak. So it becomes almost like a kind of a paradox. And this presents us with this kind of double-edged aggression. So this is the question I'm dealing with here. That when we are presented with a politics of inclusion, it's just an offer at the center, which tries to kind of balance all these things. And we are found in a situation where, you know, Isaiah Berlin talked about classically about negative and positive liberty. I mean, we don't have time to talk about that, but I mean, if you think about that, we are also told that we are somewhere in between these kind of issues, a liberty which is socially assessed and a liberty which is very much an individual form of liberty, a private liberty, if you like. But that leaves us with a very kind of confused political and economic system, which is in and of itself radically inequitable and discriminatory. And I don't need to kind of tell you how that works. And we could disagree on where and what and how this happens, but we do know that it is happening and it continues to happen, even though sometimes we think, how could this happen? Because we have been through so many decades of change, inclusion, and whatnot, in terms of, at least we're talking about schooling here, in terms of schooling, in terms of education, but also in terms of the wider society. You know, civil liberties have been gained, even though they are threatened. There are a lot of people who are still fighting for them. And yet we're still in a situation which is quite a dilemma. So the issue here, as I see it, and this is where, again, I'm pushing into the whole idea of exiting, goes back to an existential or existentialist forms of thinking in terms of education. At least this is what I'm focusing on here. I know there are other implications, but we're focusing on education and the arts. And here I'm taking a kind of a leaf from Maxine Greene. In one of her books, you know, Maxine Greene wrote a wonderful book, which I keep telling everyone to read, which is called Teacher, Stranger. But also she wrote a very small book, a little book, where she quotes actually very, very systematically a number of existentialists, thinkers, philosophers, theologians. And then she puts in between these kind of large quotes, passages, if you like, she puts in her own kind of voice in order to bridge these kind of philosophical tracts to the teacher. So I mean, the book is what it's on the tin, Existential Encounters for Teachers. And at some point she says one thing which is really interesting, and I think she's following one of Kierkegaard's quotes. She said, to be ready to learn is to be ready for a leap. And dread or anxiety is a prerequisite for pulling away from the surfaces of what is, the present, if you like, and beginning to choose possibility. I'm reading this because it's so important. A person is most fully himself, or herself, or themselves, when he, they, or she, or they are aware of the limits of possibility. The limits of possibility here is important for us, especially if we're looking at what we mean by art, what we mean by art practice, what we mean by doing and making in the arts. And also, they are overtaken by guilt when they become aware of possibilities unchosen or unrealized. So the whole idea of taking a leap, the whole idea of exiting in this case, the whole idea of becoming willed strangers is to do with the idea that we go back into the familiar, but now with a different eye. So we make ourselves a stranger, and you could see where the existentialist comes in. You know, if you think about the work of Camus, especially, which Maxine actually brings in very much in contrast with say, John Dewey, in terms of teaching strategies. Here, there's something interesting, because the whole idea of being a stranger, the whole idea of taking the leap, also implies that the limits that we have set for ourselves to be comfortable in a situation like this should be actually recognized, but also should be seen beyond, so if you like, in order to be able to see these possibilities. And when I read this, maybe because I'm a practicing artist, maybe because like you, I've engaged in arts education all my life, is that I see that what we do in the arts is very much kind of close to this. And obviously, as you know, Maxine Greene talked a lot about aesthetics education and the arts in education. So what I'm saying here, and this is again a few things which I want to clarify, is that there's also an element of unlearning in when we're talking about taking the leap. We're unlearning comfort, we're unlearning certainties. But this is not a reversal of learning to then somehow relearn. We're talking about a very different situation. I would also bring in the whole idea of indirectness, partly because if you think about the whole idea of an existentialist approach to education, the notion of indirectness as taken from Kierkegaard is very important, but this is not an abstraction. So it's not abstract to talk about the subject, and the subject is not just an internalization, let alone an abstraction of the objective world. So this is where, if we think about the outwith, which is a word which I'm really cherish, partly because it's used very much all the time in Scotland, where I worked in 2 universities, but it's not used much in England, at least I think. And I remember engaging with the word outwith, and I thought outwith is really interesting, because outwith is not outside, it's not without, and it's not just beyond. It's something to do with a willful form of estrangement, by which then, just to bring together the 2 concepts of unlearning and indirectness, we could unlearn indirectly. Now here there is another lecture to talk about, and I was telling Miranda actually how when I planned this lecture, I realized that this is a 15-week class and not a lecture for an hour. So I'm sorry about about throwing at you all these ideas, but I want to bring in this kind of context for you in order to be able to then frame, somehow bring together the idea of what we mean by this blessed notion of exiting. So when we talk about unlearning and directness, these appear in a claim. If you think about existentialism recognizes limits, and it's not just existentialists who do that, but if you think about limits and examples of these, if you think about Jean-Paul Sartre, he talks a lot about death. So how do we think about, how do we look at possibilities, which Maxine Greene talks about, beyond the reality of death? likewise beyond the reality of the absurd. Kierkegaard also brings the idea of God in a very interesting way, which is very similar, different perhaps from notions of God that we learned in our Sunday schools or whichever denomination or religion we come from. It also goes beyond the idea of the spirit, but also the idea of exteriority is interesting in Levinas, and also the issue of revelation. So these are just 6 examples of where all these theorists, unfortunately they're all men here, look at beyond those kind of limits. The limit is a recognition of something which then points us towards the possibilities that we could think of or engage with. And if we don't take the leap, as Maxine says, then these possibilities remain unrealized. And that's a big tragedy, because even though we become certain and we're all safe within the limits and the confines that we set for ourselves, including could be a progressive school, could be a liberal notion of life, where the polity is very progressive, but outside we don't really kind of care about that. So I mean, if you think about it, you could have very liberal, very democratic societies, but then they won't allow anyone in. So you could have, it's interesting how we have governments which are very progressive inside, but then when it comes to migration, it comes to other things, they are very, very conservative and not reactionary. So it's kind of interesting to think about that. And this takes me to another aspect of the outside, which has to do with pagans and barbarians. And these are very interesting words, which you would probably relate with in different ways, but there's always this kind of personal thing about it, which is really interesting, as I hope to show. So the first thing I want to think about is about the whole idea of paganism, which Lyotard brings up. And if you haven't read Lyotard's notion of, I mean, I know people talk about Lyotard only in terms of postmodernity, but actually some of his work on artists is really interesting because he deals with this whole idea of paganism. In one of his books, which is a conversation between him and Thibault, they talk about paganism in a very interesting way, and I will give some context to this. So he thinks, I mean, he argues that paganism in this case are artists, and pagans, they tend to kind of change the rules, if you like, within their own practice. So the practice is a form of opening up new possibilities within which then you can move beyond. And he brings in a very interesting concept, which those of us who engage a lot with art as practice or practice-based research would find very familiar. What we call an artist in the usual sense of the term is someone who, in relation to a given purport, the purport of the canvas and the medium, the materiality, proposes new rules of the painting game. And this gets really interesting because it's in the materiality, it's in the practice, then that we start seeing possibilities by which we can take the leap, to use Maxine's word. But then there is another concept, that of barbarism. And this is where I bring in my Maltese credentials. Being Maltese, we were, you know, most of them are Catholics there. We were brought up in how St. Paul came to Malta, which was Melita. And in the Act of the Apostles, they called the people there barbarians. And we were always told by our teachers that barbarian doesn't mean being a bad person or something like that, but actually it meant being a person who doesn't speak Latin or Greek. It's a bit like these days, you know, you have French and English as the lingua franca, which for all sorts of imperial reasons have established itself, although Spanish, it's bigger than English these days. But anyway, if you think about it in a way that you speak neither Spanish nor English nor French, then you cannot connect with much of the world. At least that's the whole idea of the barbarian in this case. But the whole idea of the barbarian is also the barbarian is the foreigner. And if you look at, say, poetry by Constantin Cavafis, when he talks about waiting for the barbarians, there's a lot of concepts in terms of the barbarian, which is not necessarily the barbarian who is the destructive person, but it is the barbarian who are the foreigners, i.e. those people who live outside the confines of the then Roman Empire, for example. The Greeks were considered as being the intellectuals, obviously, and the Romans were the powerful ones. So the barbarians were people who couldn't speak any of their languages. Now, however, there's another notion of barbarism, which actually comes from Adorno, and particularly linked to the whole idea of the absolute barbarism that you find in genocide. And obviously, in this case, we're talking about Auschwitz. So, I mean, if you're familiar with the work of Adorno, especially aesthetic theory, but also negative dialectics, but also, I don't know whether, you know, I did a doctorate on Adorno, so I'm a bit of obsessed with who translated what. Robert Hillot Cantor, actually, I think he's one of the best translators of Adorno. And he wrote a very interesting, well, he wrote several papers about Adorno, but he wrote one about what barbarism is in Adorno. And interestingly, the barbaric is also the absolute barbarism of the totality, which led to genocides like Auschwitz. But also the barbaric could be something else. So, I mean, with Adorno, there is a double kind of two-way meaning of what barbarism is. One is the barbaric that is inward, which is the barbaric that excludes, but also the barbarian, as in the person who is not civilized, quote unquote, but also the barbarism, which is absolute violence, which you can't even think of, as in the Shoah. So I'm mentioning these because these two concepts, barbarism in its twofold meanings and the pagan, keep coming back in terms of this discussion of exiting. Now, if you think about the barbaric, it gets interesting because this is an example of three artists who were basically a fascist artist. Two of them were Nazi artists. They were accepted by Hitler, you know, when he did his big exhibition of what art should be, and then he rejected all the avant-garde. I don't know what you've read about that. So there were two artists there who were obviously the official ones, accepted. And then also I'm showing you an image of the Palazzo della Civiltà Italiana, which was built by Mussolini. And Mussolini actually, like other fascists, you know, Salazar, Franco, they built huge neoclassic work. And in terms of Italian fascism, it had very strong influence of modernity, of modernism in it. And there is that kind of element in it. But when people look at these, if they don't know anything about it, they might say this is a very interesting neoclassic kind of piece. And some people take a shine to these things. But are these images barbaric in the sense of fascism, or are they even pagan in the sense of some of the paganism that some of the fascists purported to have by being outside the Christian tradition, or rather by being outside the three Abrahamic traditions, or what? And this is interesting because some people think that the barbaric in art is absolute, you know, violence and whatever. But here we have a very intriguing notion that when you look at some of fascist art, which was accepted officially by fascist dictatorships, you find yourself in these dilemmas. There are other dilemmas. For example, you know, the whole idea of Wagner, the whole question of Wagner being an anti-Semite, and the whole idea of Richard Strauss. So this is just a visual example. I can bring you examples from music, which have created a lot of discussion in terms of where these political meanings stand within them, and whether they are inward or outwards or whatever. So, I mean, I'm putting them as examples just to kind of throw in elements of discussion in what we're talking about. Now, the pagan is interesting because the Pagus was a place that was found outside the city. And we know, you know, we pay. So paga in Maltese and in Italian is payment. And these were basically the outer regions of the city, and people outside the city were not citizens, and yet they were still liable for tax. But they were considered as pagans because they were outside. They were non-citizens who were part of the bigger kind of empire, and yet they formed part of the Pagus. So the Pagus is a place found outside the city of the polis, and it's a very important concept to think about. And this is what Lyotard was talking about when he talks about the pagans. The pagans are people who are outside the citizenship of the city. And if you know, I mean, if you think about the old Greek notion, the only people who could vote in the city were citizens. Slaves didn't have any vote. Women didn't have votes. And the citizens were also chosen to be citizens in a certain way because they lived in the city. When Socrates was faced with the dilemma of whether he should exile himself or kill himself, he chose to die by poison, because for him, being exiled out of the city meant almost, you know, a dissolution of his own self. So, I mean, this whole idea of outside and inside becomes very intriguing in terms of how we were brought up to think about the polis. And let's not forget that when we talk about the Greek city was a form of democracy, as we keep calling it. Obviously, the issue of the barbarians, as I said in the Acts, was people who didn't speak the language of, if you like, of the big city, of Greek or Roman. But that implies, therefore, that there is this whole idea of the city, as I said with Athens, and the whole idea of the outside of the city. Now, this is a very important image, partly because I'm going to show another image of another enclosure, of another city, which brings out the other concept of the barbarian. So by Adorno's argument, the barbaric whole, Adorno says at some point, the whole is barbaric, basically. The whole is untruth. The whole is the false. So in this case, you have two forms of barbarism. One is the barbarian who is the outsider, as in St. Paul, or in the Acts. And the other one, and he is, he or she or they are barbarically withdrawn from this citizen designer of Auschwitz. So there's the other argument of the barbarian, who is a citizen, but he also a citizen, and I would say a citizen because he or she, they constructed a city, and this was the city. So if you think about, these concentration camps were actually small cities. They were cities of destruction. So you have a barbarism here, which becomes inwards. And this is what I'm trying to show, that visually you could think of where the barbarian outside the polis and the barbarian inside the polis was being basically destroyed as a human being. But the plan of the city, if you read some of the accounts, but also if you read Hannah Arendt when she's talking about the banality of evil and all that stuff, you're talking about efficiency. You're talking about a sense of industrialization of death, and there's a strange, eerie, very scary parallel between that kind of citizenship and the other kind of citizenship, if you like. So the image of the city, the image of the space within which we're looking at locating barbarism becomes really, really intriguing. Now, how do we deal with this? Because it's not a very easy one, and I do apologize for bringing up these kind of examples because they're not very, very comfortable and they're very disturbing. But I think they are real, and we cannot forget these examples because they are there and they're in history and they keep coming back. So if we think about this from the concept of art, if we think about this in terms of inclusion, but also if we think about this in terms of art, education, inclusion, and all of this stuff that we engage with, all of us, two things come up in mind: autonomy and belonging. Now, art is expected. It's almost like a kind of, there's an expectation on art to include. Art is expected to be inclusive, even though people keep talking about elitism and all that stuff. Our approach to art is a very inclusive one. So when we expect art to include, that immediately, because of the nature of art, it poses a dilemma for art itself as an autonomous form. If we're going to argue for art's autonomous form, or for art as a form of autonomy, which gives us the freedoms by which then we can include, by which we can go beyond, if you like, the walls of the city, by which we can take the leap. So autonomy allows us to take the leap, or once we take the leap, we are gaining autonomy, in this case, by doing art. Suddenly that kind of poses a dilemma. So this is the first dilemma, and I'll explain what this is. So this dilemma begins with art. Many expect art to act or to make something, but this is often kind of, answered. I mean, it's a bit like when we try to legitimize art in education. We find ourselves making statements which actually we don't really want to make. We don't want to argue for art in education in an instrumentalist way. We don't want to say art is there because it's useful for you to, I don't know, learn science, or because it's useful for you to do other things. Because actually that makes art into just a tool. And a tool which actually is not very, very much sustaining what we do when we engage with art, and when we bring art into education, when we look at art as part and parcel of the educational process, if you like. But sometimes we talk about a concept of inclusion by actually someone telling us and others of how we do it, and that is an expectation on art. It's almost a bit like, when we talk about art and STEM, And people expect that artists are there working with sciences in order to make the understanding of science easier, forgetting that actually there is a whole process, there is a whole autonomy within the art making, which is very, very as powerful as the autonomy within science. So, but art actually does not say anything. If art were there just to say something, then it's not art anymore. It becomes just a purveyor of something else. Artists may do art by making objects, but what they do is art. And this is something which I'm kind of, holding on to as the way by which art's autonomy and education's autonomy, which is another argument, there's another lecture there, work together. And they might be in contradiction sometimes with each other, but that's a very good dialectic, in my opinion. There's another expectation for art to belong. But this all poses an extra dilemma. And this is the whole idea of the polity. If art belongs, what does it belong to? Does it belong to an identifiable walled notion? Does it belong to an identifiable language? Does it belong to an identifiable people? Some people have done that. Or does it belong to an identifiable culture which excludes others? How about those who are outside this identifiable sense of belonging? And belonging could work both ways. Do artists or is art making us belong to something? So, I mean, does that then put us in and close us in this kind of sense of safety, this kind of sense of certainty, while then we deny ourselves those possibilities by which we can kind of engage with if we take the leap? Again, citing Maxine. So if art was simply contextualized by a polis, by a city, by a political system, by whatever we think of, making America great again, making Britain great again, whatever, is that to which then it has to belong, then it would move away from what it does. It becomes apolitical, and this is a very strange thing, because you could argue that by arguing for autonomy, I'm telling you that art shouldn't be political. But by being apolitical, in this case, it means that it becomes neuter. So, but there is another twist in this, because one could argue that what makes art is its refusal to exclusively belong to something or to someone or to an idea, and by refusing it asserts itself as art. But then this is not a question of art for art's sake, because that's another form of neutering art. Art as art is an expression of how we do autonomy. And again, it's interesting because here we're talking about doing and making all the time. If you take those out, then there's no art itself. Art itself, ars, as in Latin, not what's in English, means basically techne, means a making and the doing. So, I mean, this is really interesting in terms of how we play with these kind of meanings, but also where we are with them, because we're still talking about it. I mean, in a way, you can kind of forget all about this and let's go and do some art in a studio. But what does that mean as well? And this is interesting because there is a third aspect to this. And I want to draw attention to Toril and Camilla's work, which I've always been attracted to. And I don't know what else their work was all about, because to be honest, I keep trying to find what they are doing now, and I can't find anything. But once they did a work which was really interesting, which was basically they got 3 migrants and they asked them to go and clean the windows of this display. And that was it. Obviously, they put the display, which is them, the artists, and they're saying, I would like to do something important. And the other one said, well, how about doing something political? But then on the other hand, we have Honoré Daumier, which is one of those classical kind of pieces of political art, if you want to call it that, where you have this kind of an influence, a strong influence of how socialist realism evolved and how the whole idea of art as being that kind of didactic, in a Brechtian way, didactic notion of informing the people in order to gain back their liberty. But so the political here is really interesting in one case and in the other. In the other one, doing something political is basically doing something political in a very indirect way. Or is it political? What do you mean by, just cleaning this? And also these 3 people are migrants. And that's a very important thing because they are the pagans, they are foreigners, they are there, they're working, they're paying taxes, but actually they don't have votes. Probably they don't have the same rights that a citizen has. And that kind of plays up on a very interesting narratives there. So autonomy is art's attempt to deny any form of predetermination, as we've seen in terms of belonging, or seen in terms of it having to be an inclusive thing. Whenever but is expected to include and belong. So I mean, if we put expectations of inclusion and belonging on arts directly, if you like, within a confine which we think it's very articulate and very clear, such as the curriculum in schools, such as the school itself, such as the university ethos or whatever, i.e. in an institutionalized context, then we have a problem. And I think that the only way to do this, to go beyond that, is to disestablish it. Just as we talk about the disestablishment of the church from the state, we can talk about, as Illich would argue, of the disestablishment of education from the school, of the disestablishment of art, if you like, from the school itself, or education even. So to do something political is to deny predeterminations, which we're talking about here. Which means, in a way, is that you're politicizing art in a very different way. You're politicizing it by exiting. So this is where exiting becomes a form of redrawing the polity. We're not saying with this, you know, a bit like Brexit, we're not saying we're leaving the community, we're leaving the inclusive society, we're leaving and just go and live up in the Highlands or somewhere nice, and we forget all about human beings and that's it. We're not saying that. We're talking about something of how the exiting, how the leap that Maxime talks about, how the existential leap, how the recognition of the limits, but also the possibilities beyond the limits, how they could redraw, or how could we redraw, or art redraws the idea of the polity, the idea of community. So arts exiting into the world is an anomaly, as we've seen, because I mean, it exits, but it exits into a wider world. So it implies that the polity is redrawn. And how? I mean, I'm doing various suggestions here, but obviously I'm hoping that in our discussion, we could discuss more. One of the things could be as an autonomous act of doing, which denies itself as just a making, as just a manufactured thing, as just a process. Which is defined by a context. So basically, you know, the expectations that I talked about. Also, it exits the polis, it exits the city, if you like, or it exits the walls. It becomes political by becoming pagan and barbarian in the senses that I've talked about. And therefore, it becomes foreign. And this is interesting because when we talk about foreigners, you know, one of the things which it's a thing with me, is that, you know, I lived in Britain for a long, long time. And once a student called me a foreigner, and I got really, really upset. And I remember she couldn't understand why I got upset. I told her, look, one word which really bugs me is foreigner. Don't call me a foreigner because you know, you can call me Maltese, you can make even fun of my accent, but don't call me a foreigner. And the reason for that is that there is something there which is interesting, because the foreigner, which is interesting because when I grew up in Malta, the foreigner was the British person, the British colonial authorities were the foreigners. We call them El Barrani, which is the foreigner, the one outside. So it works both ways, and that both ways is, I think, problematic. So the whole idea of foreignness, in this case, we have to turn it on its own head, even though it becomes a willed foreignness, but this kind of foreignness becomes something different. So, I mean, there is, again, the paradox, if you like, the anomaly in terms of the same word, which could be offensive in one case, is taken over into a very totally different context. And obviously, doing art, we are used to engaging with paradox, we're engaged with aporias all the time. So, I mean, the whole idea of willed foreignness, it's a bit like willed forgetfulness. Once I wrote a paper on willed forgetfulness, which is now in one of the books, is forgetfulness does not mean denial, does not mean denying the Holocaust, does not mean denial of history, does not mean denial of slavery, as often it's being done in this part of the world. But actually, forgetfulness has to do with the idea of how, in Plato, for example, the whole idea of education is a recollection. In this case, it works against. No, it's not a recollection. Actually, it's more than that. So this is where words get stuck. And, you know, John Dewey talked a lot about this, even in the 1930s, saying how liberalism is often used as a word to mean the totally opposite of what it's supposed to be. So, I mean, we're kind of taking ownership of this and turning it around. So how can we redraw inclusion as pagans and barbarians? Can we do this? Now, in Minima Moralia, you know, as I said, Adorno argues that the whole is the false. And so that implies that the whole is barbaric in the second sense of barbarism, which is absolute destruction, a bit like inwardness. So, but you could call artists creative, as we like calling him these days, although I don't like the word, and that becomes part of the whole. In order to sometimes even the word creativity becomes, you know, we call them the creatives. And we think that the word the creative is something which is very inclusive. I find it problematic because it often feels as if it becomes instrumentalized and therefore it is serving the whole, thereby becoming part of that kind of fallacy. So, but if we do this, how then can we argue that the included citizen is the other of the excluded barbarian? And this is where the whole idea of pitting the citizen against the barbarian, citizen against the foreigner, the citizen against the refugee, against the migrant, as we keep hearing these days, becomes very, very hugely symptomatic of this whole idea of a walled notion of who we are. You know, I live in America, but actually I listen to the BBC all the time, and I watch, British films. So I know what's going on, especially on the debate on the whole idea of refugees and the whole idea of migrants. And the language there, you know, whichever ideas you have about it, or whichever opinion you have about this debate, which is a very complex one, is of the people outside and people inside, of the citizen and the refugee stroke migrant. And even the refugee stroke migrant, sometimes that kind of distinction goes for the wrong reasons. Because you could argue that if you make a distinction between them is also, you know, it's wrong. Or some people would say it's right that you just can't put them together for opposed reasons. So, but in this context is that if you're going to reject the idea of the whole, which is closed and walled, you're also rejecting barbaric creativity, by which the rational citizen has excluded the other. And this is where I mean by, exiting, because in the case, if then inclusion is that I'm including these people in and leaving everyone out or everyone else out, then inclusion becomes a form of exclusion. And that's where the whole idea of a walled notion of emancipation and inclusion becomes problematic. And I think the only way we can do this or engage with this is, at least in this context of art, becomes really exciting. The other example is obviously Paul, who was a Roman citizen, and he shocked the barbarous Maltese, if you like, the barbarians in this case, because they thought he was, first they thought he was bitten by a snake, and they thought he was a sinner, and then, you know, he did the miracle, and he survived that bite, and so suddenly they thought he was a god. And the tradition says they then became Christians. Now, in the context here is interesting because historically, what Paul was doing is what he was including them into a wider world, which was also the Roman Empire. But then Christianity, originally anti-Roman, if you like, originally outside an outsider faith, became the official Roman religion. So if you think about the outside and the inside and the logic of this, there is history which keeps intervening in this whole idea of what is outside, what is inside, which world are we exiting into. The other thing I wanted to mention is that if you think about the three Abrahamic faiths, which have been of major influence wherever we're coming from, is that has always been this kind of tension between the people or the religion of the desert and the religion of the city. And if you think about, for example, Judaism, there was an aspect of Judaism which comes from the roaming people of the desert. And then there's a Judaism which starts evolving through the rabbinic faiths and through the rabbinic traditions, actually, in the cities. So, I mean, the city and the desert, the people of the desert and the people of the city, there's always this kind of two aspects of these faiths. The same thing with Christianity, the same thing with Islam, where you always have that kind of interesting dynamic between the faith of the nomad, the faith of the person where God, if you like, the idea of the deity is found in the mountain or is found in the desert, is always hidden, but also the faith of the citizen, where suddenly God becomes part of the state, becomes almost theocratic, and also is living in the church, if you like, or in the mosque or in the synagogue. So it's a very interesting notion. This is why I keep thinking, the more you think about the whole idea of inside and outside, and the whole idea of exiting becomes really complicated and complex. And with that, obviously, there is a whole twist in terms of art, because art, how can we get out of this dilemma, if you like? I mean, I'm not offering a solution, but there are possibilities. And one of it is how art and paganism, in the sense of how I cited it with Lyotard, and the question of truth and satire. And here I'm bringing you some examples. One example is this one. I don't know whether you remember that there was this artist, was called Chen Yan, back in the early 2000s. She was going around in China dressed as Mao Zedong, and people were taking photographs of it. And she created a lot of controversy. First of all, she was a woman impersonating the great leader, but also the way people suddenly almost kind of felt as if Mao was back in a way in an art world. So there is this kind of satirical re-impersonation of Mao, the real Mao, and then you have Mao as represented in Warhol. And I like these ideas of how some of these themes or figures kind of move through the art, through the history of art, and how they become represented in different ways and what's going on there. But I also like the whole idea of satire, the whole idea of irony, the whole idea of paradox, because it reveals these kind of tensions, this dialectic that we live through when we're making art, but also when we're living our normal lives. So I think this is a very good example, and you kind of, can open up a whole discussion about the whole idea of what Chen Yan's art was doing there, simply dressing up as Mao and going around and taking photographs of people. So Lyotard, in his essay, Philosophy and Painting in the Age of Their Experimentation, which is where he talks also about paganism there, he says that if today's artworks can be identified and commented on, it is at the price of the paganism or the satire. So he's bringing together the pagan, the outsider, if you like, and the satirical. And these moments, because remember, paganism changes the rules, paralogically, changes the rules while you're playing the game. So it's a bit like we're playing chess, and suddenly on agreement, we decide that in our game, we're changing the rules of chess and creating something totally different. And paganism is a bit like that, because paganism is outside the city. So the law, in a way, works differently for the outsider. And, again, you can take this into a very reactionary argument, but you can take it also in a very progressive argument or somewhere else. But there is a satirical argument in this in terms of how you can play that game. And this is where it defies the multiple to the point of including even the computation of time. And what he's talking about here, he's not saying we're becoming a relativist in this, but he's also talking about there's not a kind of a multiple, as in he's talking about the multiple in Boyce and others. But it's not a multiplicity which is always the same. But actually, it's the rules are changing as we play them. So the more the game is multiplied, the more it changes through this kind of pagan approach. And again, I see a migration here, because if you think about Boyce, his felt suit, and then how Catalan, used the felt suit in order to shock his audience in a different way. There's also the image called La Rivoluzione Siamo Noi, which also Catalan took from Boyce and placed it somewhere else in a very ironic way. These kind of dynamics get very interesting in terms of how art plays games on its own. So if you think about the same analysis of the pagan approach to a game of chess, that we're changing the rules while we're playing the chess, you could argue that we are also changing the rules of art, which we have agreed upon, by actually making art. So it keeps going. And we push it sideways, upwards, downwards. It's not just kind of a lateral form of thinking. It's more than that. It's much more complex than that. Because then you have an audience, then you have also people engaging with that, people who are objecting to it, people who are agreeing with it, people who are even, not distracting, but actually not abstracting, but more of the word is taking out of proportion, distorting it. That's the word I'm looking for. So you can think about this in various ways. And Catalan said once, somewhere in Espresso, ci sono tre modi per vedere la storia, il tuo modo, your way, my way, and the truth. And no one is lying. So, I mean, that's kind of interesting, because this, if you think about this, is a pagan affirmation of art through Catalan, which is quite interesting to me, because okay, you could disagree with him, you could disagree with his showmanship, like many artists, but there's an interesting thing, because if you're thinking about seeing history in your way, my way, and the truth, then where is history? Are we negotiating that? Where are the walls within which we are going to get? You could argue that the walls are important because at least they give us a rule in terms of how we establish truth. And again, this is not just making everything relative, because I'm not making an argument for relativism here. What I'm making is the argument of looking at the limits, recognizing the walls, if you like, but then how do we see beyond them? How do we take the leap, the existential leap beyond those limits, whether they are the limits of death, the limits of knowledge, the limits of a divinity, or the limits of none? The whole idea of revelation, which is in itself, Tillich argues that revelation is that point by which we extend what we know beyond what is logical, if you like. And there's the other argument in Levinas, where he talks about how eternity in and of itself implies the extension beyond its limits. And so we are talking all about these things. So we're not talking about relativizing things to the extent that we become then there are no values, there's nothing. What I'm saying is that if we're talking about inclusion, then we have to see inclusion from a different point of view. And as Maxine says, the teacher needs to leave his or her baggage before going to the classroom, and in the classroom go in as a stranger. So even if you know, as a teacher, you know what the word is all about, you have your own ideas, you always enter the classroom as a stranger, because that allows you then to look at things in a different way. So you go back, your homecoming is you're going back to the familiar, but then you're making the decision not to look at it in the same way you've looked at it all your life. And that's where I would like to end. So, I mean, I do suggest books because, I mean, but as the teacher, you think about me, but I mean, this is another way of, perhaps a visual way of giving you a reference list. But I mean, I consider some of these books, you know, there are others, but these 6 books are very important, at least in terms of how I put together this lecture. There's obviously Teacher is Stranger, which I mentioned by Maxine, Existential Encounters, but also I looked at a lot at bell hooks. She's there somewhere. Outlaw Culture, there's a book called Belonging. And bell hooks actually really, really strikes me because she keeps talking about herself as being a stranger. She also talks about how, you know, growing in Kentucky and then going out and then going to when you know, schools suddenly were not segregated anymore. There's an interesting, in one of her books, she talks about how she found herself in a school which was desegregated, and how she suddenly started thinking about her old school and how safe she was in her all-Black school, and suddenly she found herself in another situation. So, I mean, she took the leap, or she was made to take the leap, and there's a totally different experience there. She talks a lot about that, how she became an academic. She talks a lot about how she never, in a way, actually being an academic for her was always disappointing, because she was looking for something which she never found, and she was always looking for something else. And she went to Ivy League schools, and then she opted to go back to a community, even though she was famous and everything, she could command a job anywhere. She went back to teach in a community college. There are the books which I mentioned, which are, you know, I wrote Art's Way Out, which is mainly what prompted me to develop these kind of thoughts, and also Artisan Learning, which is very recent. But also there's a book which I would strongly recommend by my colleague Herner Severoth, called Indirect Pedagogy. And that's where the whole idea of indirectness through Kierkegaard and others is developing. I know Herner is writing a couple of other books which are coming out with colleagues, and how, but indirect pedagogy, he talks about examples of how indirectness in the school. So it's a very practical book in terms of, he's talking about real school scenarios. How does that work? So thank you for bearing with me, and I hope this all makes some sense, and I'm looking forward to discussion. So let me stop sharing. That's an hour. Over to you, Miranda.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful, and so many ins and outs and intrigues and ways at starting points and reversals in there as well. So philosophical to hear. Would our audience like to raise questions for John? I can see a question from Neil Walton immediately in the chat. I did say we could put questions in the chat as we're going along. So Neil, would you like to ask your question? Let's get to Neil.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, John.
Hello.
Thank you so much for that. I found that really, really engaging. And I just have a question about your idea of unlearning, just for clarification, but in relation to Berlin's idea of positive freedom, which I think is really the Kantian idea of autonomy, in which one gives oneself the rule, one rules oneself. But rules, of course, are norms which only exist within socially shared forms of life, and those forms have histories. So I guess I'm asking, don't we have to be within that form of life and understand the rules more or less explicitly? I mean, I guess Lyotard is partly referring to Wittgenstein, isn't he, when he talks about a game, you know, but we need to understand those rules in order to change them. But you said that unlearning is not, you were quite explicit that unlearning is not a reversal of learning. And that seems a bit paradoxical to me, because we need to be within in order to exit, don't we?
Yeah, obviously. Yeah, I mean, I am accentuating also, this is where I take refuge in art, because art is one of those things which, as human beings, we can manage to kind of, you know, deal with the aporia in it, and in terms of dealing with the inside and outs and sideways and whatever, in order to kind of do what we do. And that's why we make art. But definitely, I do agree with you, because the whole question of positive and negative freedom is interesting. I don't know whether you know the work of Quentin Skinner. And Quentin Skinner, who was a British historian, he wrote a lot about Machiavelli and others. But I mean, one of the things which he did a lot of work on Milton and on the British the Commonwealth, when Cromwell took over, parliamentarism and all that stuff. And in a way, actually, he tries to find a third form of liberty between positive and negative liberty. As we remember, actually, there's an interesting thing that within the positive and negative liberty, there was Tony Blair at some point. He wrote to Isaiah Berlin, who was dying, trying to, you know, in those days when New Labour was all about, you know, was out there, in trying to kind of find a way of how, obviously, Tony Blair being more attracted to a negative form of liberty, which is found more in the United States, although now it's kind of becoming more and more, and also a negative form of liberty, which Thatcherism brought in, the whole idea that liberty is the lack of any obstruction. Which is different from what you say, which I agree with, and I'm more sympathetic with positive liberty, because liberty is asserted through society. But Quentin Skinner, he wrote a paper somewhere, I think in the London Review of Books, where he tried to kind of bring in another aspect, which he brought in with Romanic law, which is interesting because it brings in the whole idea of citizenship. But I presume that he is also, I remember well, also the whole idea of citizenship in and of itself is not exclusive of. So I totally agree with you that there is an inside, there is the walls, there are the limits which we have. But I think the idea of exiting is that the recognition of those would then make those walls, if you like, if not get rid of them, we need to think about what lies outside, because otherwise, within the certainties of a liberty which is all social, and which could be, you know, the whole idea of positive liberty, it becomes problematic because it does not allow anyone in, and also it becomes a problem in terms of it denies us from those opportunities, those possibilities which lie beyond. So I mean, and it's not easy, and I totally agree with you, because the more I think about it, the more I keep asking the same questions you're asking to myself, and keep thinking, yeah, but I mean, you know, you still need somewhere from where to jump, if you like. You still need a lead. But I think it's interesting, because I mean, and I'm really grateful for your question, because it opens up these questions, and I want to test this, because often I'm talking to myself when I'm doing this.
Do you mind if I just come back very quickly on that? Is that when you quoted Adorno saying the whole is the problem, and I think that's a reversal of Hegel, right? Because Hegel says the whole is the truth. But maybe we should say now that the whole is the problem, because, you know, we don't know how to talk about us. We don't know how to talk about any kind of universal address that art might have.
That's opens a very interesting one. But yeah, Dennis, thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, John, for your talk. Lots to think about. I think one of the things that was going through my mind, which is connected with what Neil was saying just now, is the notion of history in relation to in relation to the whole. In other words, I'm thinking here of Balibar's notions of insurrection and constitution. There has to be historical events from which insurrections arise, those with no voice, or whatever Rancière talks about, and, in order to make people take a leap, which could lead to a new constitution of the whole, as it were. The interesting thing about me, for me, in this notion of taking a leap is this notion of trust also. In order to take a leap, to venture forth, there has to be some kind of trust in the ground to which you return, which is not the same ground as which you leapt from.
Yeah,
that seems to me a really interesting conundrum. So, you know, scientists, artists, teachers, in engaging with historical events in their classrooms or in their laboratories, in their studios, are taking these leaps, some of which you fall flat or whatever, but you're trying to enter a new space because of what's happened, and you're trusting in that leap.
Yeah.
That you return to a ground which is not the same ground.
Yes.
And you meet this, I think you meet this, it's quite a common thing in a classroom where you're engaging with difference, with diversity, and not quite sure how to respond. But you have to respond, you have an obligation to respond.
I agree, and I mean this also links to back to what Neil was saying in terms of you know, a positive liberty. But I think, you know, you mentioned the whole idea of trust, and this is where maybe that's where the aim of why is art in education? Why do we insist on it to be in schools? Even if it's schooled, even it's sometimes very limited, even if it's distorted by all sorts of curricular and madness. Why do we still insist on it? I mean, you talk a lot about care in your recent book, but also, I mean, the whole idea of that trust is that what I find that it's starting to be missing is that there's no, it's gone. We're not even allowed to do that, even in universities. We're just allowed to kind of look at students as clients. We do products and we have a kind of a transaction with them, and that's it. But I mean, even just engaging with students these days, I was mentioning this before we started, how, you know, I mean, in 2016, I came here and I spent 3 years as doing administration in another job. And then afterwards, I wanted to go back to teach. And I found myself teaching, which is very different because before I was teaching in Dundee. Not that Dundee is different from the Midwest, but I mean, it is different. But I found myself, so there is like kind of, you know, span of 3 or 4 years. Suddenly I was engaging with students in an art school where the whole idea of identity comes through. And then I thought, because when I came here, I thought this place is very white, it's the Midwest. But actually the students, they come from, so the other issues of the identity were not to do with just race. They had to do with gender, they had to do with sexuality. And, you know, dealing with art students, you know, that they're also kind of, you know, bringing this into their work. But I mean, what they were saying, and also I learned a lot, I keep learning a lot from them in terms of how to engage with this kind of other possibilities, these other attentions, but they are asking for trust. They are asking for, you know, we're taking these leaps, you know, life, everyone is against us because I'm saying that my gender is different from what you want it to be. And yet there is no trust because everyone is either attacking you, or even those who are righteous and want to help them, actually, they find themselves in this kind of, you know, I mean, I find that sometimes these students are more critical of the white liberals, to call them that, who want to help them, or they claim to, who are then those who actually reject them, because those who reject them, they know them, they know who the fascists. But when it comes to the other side, if you like, the kind of wishy-washy liberal kind of thingy, you know, as you know, some of the many white liberals critique woke, they critique everything, they critique political correctness, and it's very odd. And this is where, and yet they're talking about, you know, standardizing almost inclusion. And I mean, seeing it from the eyes of these young people, actually, I find, and I mean, I don't know what's, but I mean, they told me, some of them told me even in schools, how in primary and second, especially secondary schools, where here it's becoming more and more difficult to even come to terms with your own gender, because there are certain schools where they're not allowed. Students are not even allowed to talk about their own identity, whatever it is. I think that what you're talking about is that trust. How can they take the leap? If we're going to eliminate that, then we have a huge problem. Even if we can, reify the whole idea of inclusion, it's still trapped in the inside. We're talking about these students who are taking leaps, who are taking kind of very serious stuff. So and this is where art maybe comes in, and I don't want to romanticize it, but I think even how we engage with art, or how we engage art with this, becomes quite interesting in terms of those kind of questions. So, yeah, Miranda, sorry. I'm looking at things now.
We've got a couple of questions. One from Esther. Esther, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, John. Thanks very much. There's loads in there, and I'm kind of unpicking it in relation to my own experience. And I guess I kind of want a little bit of help with that. That was really interesting, because you and Dennis were just talking about some of those issues around autonomy. And that was the idea that I kind of been following as you've been speaking, but I'm not sure I quite got hold of it fully. I teach at Goldsmiths, I teach within art education. And I feel that that idea of autonomy is something that increasingly I have to use within what I teach in order to draw away from the bigger institution, in order to enable a kind of authentic teaching to continue to take place where the pressure is perhaps other than that. So there's a kind of survival in autonomy. Autonomy provides a positive space. So then I'm trying to link it back to the ideas that you brought in around inclusion, which are really valuable to me, because I've been working on kind of critiquing inclusion and the arts for quite some time. And so then I'm kind of thinking about, well, just the teaching that I'm going to do in a couple of days. And we have a lot of Chinese students within the university, and I'm increasingly aware that we're not talking about China to the Chinese students. We're talking about the UK and the contemporary art within the UK. So I'm trying to construct a session in which I talk about Chinese artists, and I do this in a way that is, well, I guess, inclusive in a way, but at the same time, I'm taking those students to quite an uncomfortable position, I think, in order to try and exercise a kind of autonomy, I guess, with them. But so I guess I'm really kind of wondering, how do I link inclusion, and what have I missed in terms of kind of understanding?
I think it's interesting, because this book I'm finishing about belonging, there are a lot of essays which I wrote when I was back at Warwick. And one of the things which I remember, I had the same recently when I came back to teaching. I had the same issues you're having. I found myself teaching a very basic class, partly because of the way structures are. I ended up teaching this class, which is an introduction to art, which we teach as a liberal arts provision, which everyone has to take, because it's a kind of an American sort of thing. And so I was faced, like you said, I looked at my classes, which I used to teach at Gray's, which were basically similar. And I realized how white and Eurocentric they were. And then I looked at the students. We have a lot of Asian students here. And I thought, if I'm talking about Caravaggio, I wasn't even sure. I kept asking, do you know the story of this Christian story and whatever? So I got really almost depressed by it, because there was a set book which I didn't like, and then I kept thinking about these students with different forms of identity, students we're talking about challenging the whole idea of gender, students women artists who were nowhere to be seen in these textbooks. So I'm always have this problem is we keep talking about, is it just changing the content? So if we flood our classes with different examples from art, which is useful, I think at least we could start from there. Is that enough? And that's the question you're talking about, because this is the whole idea of there's a kind of, and I'm mentioning this because if you look at, I remember, I was rewriting a paper, which originally when I started teaching, I went back to African philosophy. There was a guy who just died recently called Wiredu. And he talks about and he was trained and he studied in Oxbridge and all that stuff. So he came out as one of the kind of very much European philosophers. But then he started looking at philosophy in Africa. Is there an African philosophy? And he found himself engaging with storytelling with language. This is another thing which I keep talking about myself. I never learned mathematics, science, philosophy in my own language. I never learned it in Maltese. I always learned it in English. So I remember when I was a kid, I had a problem with mathematical problems because I couldn't understand what they were asking for. So the concept of numeracy, I never learned numeracy in my own language. And that gets really interesting in terms of, and he talks, to cut the long story short, is that what we read was talking about is the whole idea of universals and particulars, and how the particulars and the universals work together. And this is what we're talking about here. If we're talking about the particularities of someone coming from China, or someone, and China is big enough to, people coming from China are different as well, because they come from different parts of China. They might even speak different languages, probably. The Hans are different from the Uyghurs, for example. But I mean, even that is already complex. But they're coming here, or they're coming, in Britain or here, and they are expecting, what are they looking at? Are they looking at a universalized form of knowledge? And I talk a lot about how, I insist on students taking ownership of their learning, like everyone else. And, we come from that tradition. But often I think, how on earth are we going to help these people or equip them? Do we train them? What do we do? Because if I'm doing that, then I'm almost instrumentalizing even the question itself of instrumentalism, of inclusion. So I think it is a very complex thing because of these kind of, dialectical intricacies. I'm not saying we should give up, but I think at least if we're aware of them. What you're saying could be, again, another whole discussion, which would take many hours. But I think it's important that we're talking about, because by actually emancipating, Ernesto Laclau wrote a book called Emancipations with an S at the bracket at the end. It's interesting because emancipation itself could be a form of bringing everyone into this whole, which becomes the false. So I mean, that's the preoccupation in this kind of thing. And I think art brings it up, because art is aporetic in nature. And hopefully it allows us to at least engage with this kind of dialectic, if you like.
Yeah, and in many ways, if we steer clear of trying to ask art to solve the problem for us, but allow art to be an autonomous space in which things can be explored, then we avoid acculturating new students into a system.
That's exactly what I mean by autonomy. I mean, I totally agree with you, because there's autonomy of art, there's autonomy of education, there are all forms of autonomies who are coming together. And Balibar talks a lot about that, how autonomy and heteronomy come together. And then he says heteronomy, we start with heteronomy, go to autonomy, and then we'll go back to heteronomy. It's almost like a kind of, it folds onto itself, because autonomy in and of itself on its own then excludes heteronomy. So I mean, how do we deal with that? Intriguing.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. We have a question from Amanda Kipling also. Amanda, would you like to ask your question?
Hello, thank you very much for that absolutely fascinating talk. I really do want to go over it again and pick out other bits, because there's such a lot in there. But what really sort of caught my attention, and I think you've been talking this through a bit with Esther in that last question, is this tension between inclusion and autonomy and emancipation. And I'm a dramatist. I train the PGCE drama teachers. So I'm coming at it from a broader art perspective. And I just wondered whether you'd had any thoughts about what you were talking about in terms of dramatic art, where I was just thinking as you were talking, when we engage in educational drama, children go into role, and they are at once their own inner self and their outer, they are their own stranger. In a sense, I've put maybe their own barbarian, and that you've got a really interesting, rich educational area there that I hadn't thought about quite in these terms before. And I just wondered if you'd had a chance to think about dramatic art at all, and had got anything to offer to develop that at all.
Yeah, I actually wrote, one of my favorite dramatists, if you can call him that, in Italy is Dario Fo. Dario Fo, he won the, I mean, he died now, but he won the Nobel Prize and all that stuff. And I remember writing a piece about Dario Fo, and he wrote that, he did the play called Trumpets, Raspberries, and
Accidental Death.
Yeah, he did the Accidental Death, and he did the Raspberries one. And I remember talking about writing a paper once for philosophy, which they rejected it. But then I published it somewhere else about the philosophy of the whole idea of satire in education and art and the raspberry, you know, which in a certain cultures like Italian, maybe Maltese, we use it a lot as a form of denigration and whatever. I mean, you know, blowing a raspberry to, you know, there's that film Loro di Napoli, The Gold of Naples, where De Filippo blows a big raspberry and he said with a raspberry you could make a revolution. And it's interesting how, and people taught me, what the hell is a raspberry? You make a very rude sense with, you know, no. And I wrote a whole piece about that because actually Dario Fo is really interesting because he takes these kind of scenarios, what we're talking about, into consideration in terms of how, but also the whole idea of satire. So, I mean, I was tempted to bring in Dario Fo in the lecture, but I thought this would go on forever and extend somewhere else. But also, I like also the critique of Boal, and I can't say that I'm an expert in Boal, but I mean, his critique of Aristotle isn't really interesting in terms of how everyone, you know, goes with Aristotle and stuff like that. But he kind of blows up the sacred cow and he moves out of that. But definitely what you're saying is, and I'm not an expert in drama, but what you're saying in terms of the whole idea of, you know, finding your own barbarian, if you like, within yourself, being the stranger. I think what Maxine is talking about, and she did a lot about in her book, Variations on a Blue Guitar, which basically are transcripts of her lectures that she did in Lincoln Center, where she was philosopher in residence. She did a lot of work on all the arts, so including dramatic arts, and basically because she was also a specialist in English literature, I think she brings in Beckett and all the other. I mean, Beckett, for example, is another case. And I use Beckett a lot with my students, visual artists, who actually find Beckett extremely intriguing in terms of what he's bringing in, because he brings them into a scenario where they have to get out of wherever they are, and they have to live in a totally different world. And I think, you know, that, you know, I mean, this does not, I don't want to be like, you know, someone who keeps advocating for the arts, but if you think about it, if we had, you know, dramatic arts, visual arts, music arts in schools, dance in schools all the time, I mean, can you think about how kids would look at the world in a totally different way? And it's not just a romantic thing. I think because it brings in stuff which you could never engage with in any other discipline. And to me, even that basic argument, if I had a politician in a lift and I give him 2 seconds of it, that's what I would, or hair or whatever, I would tell them that, because I think those experiences you're talking about, how on earth can you talk about the leap unless you engage in dance or in drama? You can't find it, you know, you can't just sit down and read Shakespeare. I mean, I remember, again, as a kid growing up in Malta, trying to read Shakespeare, I couldn't make sense of the man, apart from his English, and I wanted to watch the whole thing. I wanted to be able to engage with that, but I never had the opportunity. So, I mean, yeah, I think it's so fascinating. So, yeah, I mean, I wish I could talk more eloquently about dramatic arts, but I totally am excited about what you just said about how students, you know, take on other characters, they get out of their own character, and how they inhabit someone else. And it's to do also with empathy, you know, the whole idea of phenomenology and empathy, and the whole idea. Edith Stein wrote a wonderful book about empathy, who then became a saint, you know. Is quite, and Edith Stein is always interesting because Edith Stein studied with Husserl. She was Jewish and an atheist, and then she became Catholic and became a Carmelite nun, and then, you know, she died in Auschwitz. So, I mean, and her work is very much geared towards that kind of notion of empathy, and how empathy becomes, to link it to what Dennis was saying, the whole idea of feeling safe in terms of empathy. Where is empathy in education? How do we engage with it? Sorry, I keep going.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you, John. That's absolutely fascinating. We only have a few more minutes left to go. I had a brief question about examples of what you mean by taking liberties with inclusion. If you would have any examples, just a couple very quickly in art education as to what that might mean. And then I'll have to wrap it up, unfortunately. But yeah, if you have a couple of examples, that would be fantastic.
Oh, gosh. I don't know, to be honest with you. I mean, I threw that in and I was looking at it and I said liberty. At first I was thinking of freedom, and then I said, yeah, in English, taking liberty is also something. I would say taking liberties in art has to do with risk. And I just want to, without me going on and on forever, I was associate dean down in Falmouth And as you all know, in Britain, we have to do all these QAA things, and I had to streamline all these curricula or these syllabi. And I remember insisting that one of the learning outcomes should be taking risks. And one of my colleagues, she told me, you're putting students then at huge risk, because how they are going to take risk, and what if it fails? It was a very interesting question, but I mean, what I meant by taking risk is, how do we teach risk? How do we encourage our students? I mean, we know this in art school, how we value risk and becomes part of our own assessment process in terms of them taking the risk. Even at this, it's to do with seeking the error. It's to do with finding the mistake and being wrong. And I think which goes back to Meno and goes back to Socrates. And I think that's where taking liberties with inclusion could be, that if we want to challenge inclusion in a safe space, which is a university, then we have to think about it like we're thinking about it now, rather than just assuming that inclusion is just one form of safety within a walled structure and with all these reassurances of some kind of theories that we have developed. Those are important, but I think we need to move that. I mean, people call it critical thinking. I don't know what you can call it, but I mean, personally, even the word doesn't make sense anymore. But we definitely, I would say, taking liberties is to do with risk. And us, people who come from the arts, we know what it means to assess risk-taking in our students' work and in our own work as well when we engage with each other. So that's how I would put it. It's a bit safer for me to talk about risk than taking liberties. But yeah, and also to be disobedient, as our friend Dennis keeps talking about. So the whole idea of being disobedient, the whole idea of doing all those kind of being naughty. You talked about naughty. This is a naughty thing, but I think naughty is also interesting. So how to be naughty in order to be able to be inclusive.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. And we could chat all evening on these questions, and you did say it would be a whole course, and that's exactly right.
Yes.
I think there's a course there.
There you are.
And we look forward to seeing that advertised internationally. So
Yeah.
thank you so much, John Baldacchino, and to all our audience and to the questions from the audience. If you'd all like to come on camera and say hello, you're very welcome to do that now. Our next CAL event is with James Bully, Dr. James Bully, on the 29th of November, who James has written an influential report on practice research, and he's coming in to do a presentation called Creating Practice Research. So hopefully there'll be some connective points in terms of challenging the whole and the idea of exiting into the unknown and becoming the stranger among the familiar, which is the kind of continuing paradox that your work is grappling with, John. So thank you so much for your presentation today. We look forward to reading your books and indeed the Handbook on Continental Philosophy. So and thanks very much to our audience.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Well done. Thanks. Thanks, Miranda.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Miranda.